This video will recap the process of natural selection and the different types of selection, and it will also look at speciation. So we'll start by defining what evolution is. Evolution is the change in organisms over the generations as a result of changes to their genome, and this is going to lead to offspring that are much better adapted to survive in their environment than the previous generation. And we call this natural selection, and this is the process that we're seeing here. So we say that natural selection is a non-random process. We do talk a lot about mutations being random, and that is a really important part of natural selection, but the actual selection process itself is non-random. We're favouring characteristics that help organisms survive and reproduce. Nature is selecting the individuals that are best adapted. And if we look at this diagram here, we can see that the light coloured moths are better camouflaged in this unpolluted area, whereas in this really polluted area where we have lots of soot in the trees, it's going to favour the dark moths. So in this polluted area, we can see that the DNA sequences that code for this dark phenotype are going to increase in frequency, whereas your light coloured moths are going to decrease in frequency. And the reason for that is the birds are going to see them and they're going to eat them before they get a chance to pass those favourable alleles onto their offspring. And if we look at this selection graph, you can see that when the Industrial Revolution happened and we had the very sooty trees, the population shifted. We see that the dark variety were favoured in the population and the allele frequency shifted as a result of natural selection. Okay, so before we start looking at different types of selection, we'll have a look at the different ways that genetic material can be passed on. And the first way is through vertical gene transfer. And this is where genes are passed from parent to offspring. And this can occur in prokaryotes and eukaryotes. And it can be as a result of sexual selection, which is involving two parents. Or it could be a result of asexual reproduction, which involves one parent. And the key thing here is that genes are being passed from parent to offspring in the next generation. And vertical gene transfer makes the selection process longer, as these mutations that occur need to be advantageous so that that individual can survive to reproductive age and then pass on those favourable characteristics to their offspring. So we'll now look at horizontal gene transfer, and this is when genetic material is passed between individuals within the same generation. And this occurs more commonly in prokaryotes, and it contributes to a much faster evolution rate. We can see here that this prokaryote has had a mutation in its plasmid, and it's going to pass that plasmid to another individual within the same generation. So now this prokaryote has that advantageous mutation. And this bacteria will again be more likely to survive, and therefore evolution has been more rapid than if we were passing from parent to offspring. And this can result in strains of bacteria emerging that are resistant to antibiotics, which we call superbugs. And bacteria that are resistant to those antibiotics have that selective advantage, and they pass on those resistant genes to other bacteria through horizontal gene transfer. Okay, so now looking at the different types of selection. So we know that phenotype frequency can shift as a result of the selection process. And the three different types are stabilising selection, directional selection, and disruptive selection. Okay, so the first one that we'll look at is stabilising selection. And this is when we have an average phenotype that is selected for and extremes of the phenotype are going to be selected against. And just remember that phenotype is the physical characteristic of an organism. And if we look at this original population, or the dotted line, we can see that we did have these extremes of the phenotype. And after the selection process, we had lots more of this average phenotype being selected for. And a really good example of stabilising selection is birth weight in babies. Babies with a medium weight are going to be much more likely to survive, because the ones with low weight are going to lose heat really quickly or get sick from infection. Whereas ones with high birth weight, that's going to be difficult for the mother to deliver. So we select this medium weight through stabilising selection. So second one is directional selection, and this is when we have an extreme phenotype being selected. And this is really common in periods where we have lots of environmental change. So for example, thinking about the peppered moth again, we had changes to the pollution levels in environment, and it was going to favour either the dark or the light coloured variety of moth due to better camouflage from predators. So we can see that after selection had occurred, we had this shift more towards this dark variety of moth. The last one we're going to look at is disruptive selection. So this is when two or more phenotypes are selected for. And this tends to occur when two different habitats or different types of resource become available. And we can see this really well in the finches here. We've got an increase in small beaks and an increase in large beaks. And this is due to the ones with the small beaks being able to eat things like small seeds, and the ones with large beaks are going to be able to eat things like your large fruits. And that's going to decrease the competition for food. And disruptive selection leads to speciation. So you can see that we've got different species of finch evolving here. And speciation is just the evolution of a new species over time. And we'll look at the different types of speciation in a second. So this is an example of an SQA question, so you can pause and see if you can work out which selection process is being represented. So graph 1 is showing this population moving towards an extreme phenotype, so that would be directional. And in graph 2 we can see that the population is favouring these extreme phenotypes, so that would be disruptive. And graph 3 is showing this average phenotype being selected for, so this would be stabilising. So speciation is the generation of a new biological species by evolution. And we say that a species is a group of organisms that are capable of interbreeding and producing fertile offspring. And we say that they do not usually interbreed with other groups as well. So if we look at our cat species here, we've got lions, tigers, jaguars, and they've got really similar traits if we just look at their morphology. They've got similar body shape, facial and paw structure, they can roar, but we would say that all of them are unable to mate to produce fertile offspring, making them all distinct species. So hopefully we're familiar with the process of speciation from Nat 5 biology. We have three main processes occurring in the evolution of a new species. We have isolation, mutation, and natural selection. So if we start by looking at our original population here, we have a large population with a common gene pool. This just means that they're all interbreeding with each other and they're all exchanging genes through gene flow. And our original population is going to become isolated. We can see here that we have a large mountain range in the way, so we would call this a geographical barrier. So there's going to be no gene flow in between these two new subpopulations. And in each of these new subpopulations, we're going to have different mutations occurring. Remember that mutations are random. And some of those mutations may offer them a selective advantage. So on this side of the mountain, our selection pressure is temperature. So we can see that some of these individuals have developed some fur. And that is going to give them the selective advantage on that side of the mountain. And we say that the best adapted to the environment are going to survive to reproductive age, and they're going to pass on those advantageous genes to their offspring. So the furry individual is going to survive, it's better adapted, and it's going to pass on that gene to its offspring. And we call this process natural selection. And over a long period of time, we are going to remove that mountain range barrier. So again, that's happening over millions of years. And we're going to know that we have a new species because they're no longer able to interbreed to produce fertile offspring. So we've got two new species that have been formed. So we just talked about preventing gene flow through isolation barriers. There's three types of barriers that we need to know about: behavioural, ecological, and geographical. In the last diagram that we looked at, we saw that there was a mountain range that separated our population into two new subpopulations. That would be geographical. So things like mountains, it could be deserts, it could be rivers, anything that is going to physically separate our population. It could also be to do with habitat fragmentation, so things like deforestation. We also have behavioural barriers, which are to do with the behaviour of the organism. It could be that they're fertile at different times of the year. It could be things like courtship behaviour, things that are to do with behaviour. And ecological barriers, those are things like your abiotic factors. So it could be a change in temperature, it could be like a change in pH that are separating a population. So things like freshwater fish, they can't survive in the salty ocean water, and most marine fish aren't going to be able to live in fresh water. Therefore, they're never going to come into contact with each other. There's never going to be gene flow between those populations. So we have an ecological barrier. So we need to know which type of barriers lead to which type of speciation. And there's two types of speciation that we need to know about. We have allopatric and we have sympatric speciation. And allopatric speciation is caused by geographical barriers. So it's going to occur when we've got that physical separation of our population, and we're going to have to adapt to different selection pressures. So we can see here that we have a mountain that is separating our population of trees, and a new species of tree has formed on this side of the mountain as a result of that geographical barrier. So I always think allopatric Alps, something like a mountain is going to physically separate your population. And sympatric speciation is going to occur within the same habitat, so that could be due to behavioural barriers or ecological barriers. You can see that we've got two species of tree that have evolved within the same area. So if we look at this tree population here, it could be that they have adapted to a different pH level, it could be different levels of light intensity, but it has evolved within the same area. So I always think sympatric sounds a bit like same. It is the same environment. So a good example of allopatric speciation are the squirrels of the Grand Canyon. You can see here that we've got two species of squirrel that have evolved on either side of the canyon. Remember that geographical barriers led to allopatric speciation. And this happened about 10,000 years ago. We had one population of squirrels that lived continuously across what is now the canyon. And as the Grand Canyon formed, it created this geographical barrier that split the squirrel population in two. So they were separated from each other and they had different environmental pressures on either side, things like food sources, climate, predators. And again, that led to lots of genetic differences as a result of mutations. And we ended up with these two new species of squirrel. They were no longer able to interbreed to produce fertile offspring. And it's less likely to occur in things like birds because they could just fly across this geographical barrier. And a good example of sympatric speciation are the cichlid fish in African lakes. Remember that sympatric speciation occurred as a result of behavioural or ecological barriers. They were all within the same environment. And some populations began to prefer different feeding areas. So some were eating insects near the surface, some were eating algae off the rocks at the bottom. Others were developing different mating preferences, so they were choosing mates based on their colour patterns and things like that. And over time, these behavioural and ecological differences reduced interbreeding, and that led to the formation of a new species without that physical separation that we'd have from a geographical barrier.